So this evening we have two incredible guest speakers. Firstly, Dr. Carl Ann Ó'Sioráin, an assistant professor of early childhood education at Dublin City University, who is going to talk about supporting language and literacy for children with additional needs. And secondly, we have Deirdre Field O'Sullivan, a master's student at Portobello Institute and an early learning and care teacher at Further Education and Training Board in Cork, who will be discussing neurodiversity affirming practice and how it can support language development. But firstly, and without further ado, I will now hand you over to our esteemed keynote speaker, Dr. Carl Ann Ó'Sioráin. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Maeve. It's very, very nice of you to invite me, and I'm delighted to see so many people here this evening. So I suppose first and foremost, if I can get my slide up and make sure that you can all see it. Is that okay, Maeve?
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Lovely. Okay. And apologies for the voice. I have a small technical issue at the moment with my voice, but I'm hoping that you can all hear me well. So thank you, yes, once again for inviting me. And tonight's presentation, this is the difficult thing, in fact, because it's quite technical to talk about supporting language and literacy. So there are some slides that you might have to stop and think about and maybe go back to again yourself as you review them. But I think what you'll find is that it's very interesting. So just to introduce myself very, very quickly and very briefly, I'm a Montessori trained teacher who went back because I was employed full time in mainstream education to do full-time primary school teaching. So I have both qualifications and I use both of my qualifications in a very proud way. I'm very proud to be an early childhood educator. But what I'd really like to know is what you're looking to learn today. So it would be really good if you could add to the chat just a few things that you maybe want to start thinking about or learning about today. So to start us all off, really, what I want to do is to talk to you about what literacy is and why it's so important in the early years, and particularly in relation to children with additional need. So children, according to McWhinney here, they learn language gradually and inductively rather than abruptly and deductively. So inductively means that it's actually within the social communication realm that children learn their language. So from very, very young, even before they're born, they're listening to rhythm, they're listening to patterns. And so when they are born and they are being held by the caregiver, they are discriminating sounds immediately. So we know that. And that is incredibly important because the greater the emphasis on the relationship between the child and the caregiver, the bigger the possibility of that child being able to distinguish those auditory sounds. So there are certain articulating patterns that happen for very young children. And this is why it's quite important to realize and recognize verbal and non-verbal behaviors. So it's very rare that any child, even with a learning disability, would be non-verbal because they have articulatory patterns such as babbling, such as crying. The differences in tone when a child is crying is very important. And then we have what is called the emergence of first words. And what we talk about there is we're talking about those lexical principles because we, as the caregiver, the teacher, we label words that they see. For instance, bottle, we label bottle, we label spoon, we label mug or cup. So those are the very, very, very beginning words, and they're not visual in the sense of the word itself. They're visual in the sense of the objects. So a child surrounded by objects that are introduced to them early and who create meaning to the object, okay, has a better understanding. And these are really important things. So say, for instance, when we have a very young child and we're climbing up the stairs and we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps. That's part of that lexical principle business. We are labeling the number of steps as we move forward. So from a very young age, and this is what's really important for us, is that actually we need to start recognizing when children start to pay attention, when children start to observe and make meaning, even by reaching out and taking an object because we've referenced it. So the social supports then are part of the emergence of these utterances or these words. And it's all based on the fact that the child is leading the meaning, because the child is bringing the adult to this um, interaction as such. So teacher-child interactions, parent-child interactions are a key perspective in this imaginative space, in this imaginative idea. What I want you to do, though, is I want you to think really hard about what do we really know about child interactions, child to child interactions, child to teacher interactions, child to parent interactions. Do children become more vocal? Do they become more communicative in different situations? And so how then do they relate that to their language learning or their engagement of it? So if you think for a second about a child um, who is maybe say 4 or 5 months old, how that child is moving around in their cot, in their crib, on the floor, on the chest of the parent, and what is happening in those interactions that makes the child become aware of their environment. So I'm going to ask you to look at a video now, just for a second or two. But what I really want you to do is I want you to listen really carefully to the sounds that the children are making in the video. They're very young babies, but they are making really important sounds. And those sounds help us to be able to identify how children are progressing, how they're connecting to their environment. So write down your thoughts in the chat facility here. Let us know what you're thinking when you see what's going on. What is it that makes those children literate in the moment? Okay, so there are oral skills and abilities. So I'm asking you to listen to high and low notes made by the children, because actually that's how we respond to music, and it's how we tune into the caregiver's voice. Okay, so listen really carefully to this small little piece of video, and write down what you're thinking. Can I just check in that you can hear that, May?
Perfect. Perfect. Yes.
Yeah, all good.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I'm just going to stop it there for a minute, okay? And what I want you to do is, and I'm going to go back very quickly to the previous slide. What I want you to do is tell me What did you hear when you heard those two children talking to one another in the high chair? And then the two really small children, actually, whose physical bodies aren't quite mature enough for them to sit up straight. So, what was it that you were hearing? And can I ask Maeve to tell me what is in the chat because I won't be able to see it?
Okay, in the chat. Okay, video 2, the babies are communicating.
They are.
Okay, let me see anybody else. Anybody else any comments? The babies appear to be talking to each other. The babies appear to be talking. In the high chair, I was hearing two very happy children.
Yeah.
Uh, they are using different tones to get a reaction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, mirroring sounds.
Yeah,
Turn taken.
that's right.
So sorry, no. So gorgeous. Lovely to see them communicate in their own way. You could hear the first two children are excited, and the second video, the eye contact is so lovely.
Now,
Oh,
what you've just given me there, Maeve, is huge. I mean, everybody that's contributed to those comments, you're absolutely right. We're talking here in particular about children whose development is currently normal. Okay. And this, I think, is very important because the physical ability to look at another individual is what's a key piece here, is getting that eye contact, being able to respond to a sound, being able to engage with another person. And even when you said that they altered their tone, that they had high pitches and they had low pitches, those are the very, very, very important and practical elements of learning a language from a very early age. So when children present as having some difficulties in that area, we need to focus on making sure that they have good hearing, that they are receiving the messages that we are giving. Because even drawing attention in the visual to listen, to putting hands on throats, to listening to the sound that comes from the face, the movement of the muscles is really important. So touching, letting children touch, letting them feel the breath out is really important. So from a really young age, we need to be looking for what those children were doing, how those children engaged, and how they were taking turns, tuning in to sounds in their environment. And it's the same, even if we were talking about children that did not have a particular need, we do exactly the same. We draw them in to listen. And one of the most important things are look and listen. And we use those in the visual elements as well. So I'm going to very quickly touch on this topic, and I know that Deirdre's going to touch on it a little bit further along the line. But when I'm talking about children with additional needs, I'm talking about children who may have Down syndrome, for instance, or may have an intellectual disability. They may have developmental language disorder. They may have hyperactivity disorder. Sometimes we don't know this straight away. Sometimes we need time to get to know the children to be able to understand them. And they all come under what's called a neurodiversity umbrella. But there's another argument to this, and that is that Judy Singer, who is an autistic advocate in America, she identified neurodiversity and started to use the label for people who are autistic in themselves, not necessarily for all these other areas that are of complex need. Now, Dave, Milton. Milton says that it could be neurominority rather than neurodivergent. And David McLaughlin in 2021 said this is all identity politics. The thing we need to remember is that we are guided by the Diversity, Equality and Inclusion Charter and guidelines for early childhood care and education. And we must adore or adapt to what it is that they are saying. Okay. So we make sure that we reference them in particular, and we go by that, not necessarily the overall bigger argument of what neurodiversity might be or might not be. But Deirdre will elaborate on this coming forward. So what I'm talking about is what makes a child with an additional need the same but different. What are the common but unique areas of challenge for children in general, especially in relation to learning a language and being part of that engaging, communicative area. So when I talk about communication skills for very, very young children, what I'm actually talking about is the looking for the I piece. Okay, it's back to that emergentist, it's back to behaviorist approaches. It's looking for children who are looking for something for themselves. Okay, so they are requesting something. So, even a toddler that's wriggling in a nappy is telling you something. And being aware of what that communication is means that that child will understand that they are communicating even through their behaviors. Or it might be something around the feeding. When you're feeding a child, when a child stops for a moment, that you are saying, oh, you're stopping for a moment. Maybe we want to wind, and that you're doing things like that. The same with dressing, that they're trying to put on their socks. You're trying to put on your socks. And we start at a very young age with children who we know have a difficulty with something like signing. And that might be in relation to holding the object and pointing to the object, or it might be through the Irish love system. So making sure that we understand communication from a full, total communication system is really important. So another way in which children communicate is through their sensory experiences. Being able to read those sensory experiences lets us know that children are establishing certain dispositions to be able to learn. So, how are they going to be resilient? How are they going to be able to cope in the world in which they live? And they do that sometimes through sensory experiences. So, being upset by noise, or actually looking for noise, looking for stimulations, they all come back to a system of communication. Now, I have something here that I'm going to talk about very briefly, and it's called executive function. And I'll maybe hit on it again a little bit later on. But actually, this is the business of knowing how your body is working, knowing how your body is located within the environment in which you are. So when you get up in the morning, your executive function happens without you even thinking about it. You start thinking about how you're planning your day. You go down the stairs and you have breakfast. Some people have hot breakfast, some people have cold breakfast, because their sensory processes are part of the executive function. So it tells you where to start and when to stop. So understanding routines begins in that executive functioning space. So enabling children to communicate, that they understand when they're going to go somewhere, is really important. All children need these supports. It's the same with behaviors that are observed. So whether those behaviors challenge us, or whether they are something that we notice and observe as being, that's interesting, we actually need to start looking at, why are the behaviors so important? Because behaviors are how children strategize. Okay, they're looking to distract from something, or they're looking to cool down, they're looking to seek help, or to clarify situations. And actually, this happens to learners, even very young dyslexic children who find engaging in planning for speaking and listening, so that they're getting things in the right order. So those behaviors are really important. The other thing that we have are the social learning relationships. Like I mentioned earlier on, the building of those interactions, those social interactions, they're all part of the relationship building, knowing what's going to happen if they do this, knowing that I affect you, we affect them. So those kind of social relationships are really important. And every single learner, especially learners with additional need to know those. And I'm going to tell you how we do this a little bit later on. And then what's really important here is that we actually start addressing our own possible um, hidden biases that we might have. So if we're told that a child, for instance, has Down syndrome, or a child has ADHD, or a child has, for instance, autism, the thing for us to really, really, really remember is that actually we have to aim high. We don't we don't curtail ideas. We don't bring them down to a lower level. We don't go down. We try and bring the child up. And we do that through scaffolding and what we call is teachable moments. So spotting an opportunity to say a word to a child or to say, yes, that's right. This is what we're doing. So it's all about those super sensitive child interactions that we all need. Now, I'm going to get a bit technical here with you, okay? Because in the very young child who struggles in the area of communication and language learning, we need to be super sensitive to the child's verbal behaviours. Now, when Skinner wrote about verbal behaviours, and there's a lot of, say, contrasting opinion about whether or not Skinner's work is suitable across all aspects, but that's because of behaviourist approaches have been misinterpreted. And it's about how we really understand Skinner's verbal behaviours. So what's really interesting here in early childhood and special education is the glimpse that this theory gives to verbal or minimally verbal children. So in the video, you saw very young babies engage in vocalizing, yeah, in exchanging non-verbal communications with their eyes, with their head turning, and you said that they were responding to vocal sounds made by another. So in actual fact, autoclitics, which is the very first thing here, are verbal responses that modify an effect on a listener. So for instance, by doing that cooing and that, and you could even hear the vowel sounds within them. By doing that, it's drawing the listener to the relationship. And so building the functional relationship. And the purpose of an observation like those children is to find where the relational expressions are. So those I stories that we see. So a child who might draw your attention and go, ooh, and point to a cat. Okay, they're those I stories. The child sees the cat. I see a cat. So the adult is drawn then to the cat, and that is really important. We have to make sure that we get very good um, examples of this from families, because the families have been engaging with this child. So we want to know, how does the child draw your attention to their needs or their understanding of what is in their environment, so that we can look out for it and then in a way strengthen the child's abilities by leading into being more responsive. Okay, so that means that there's a level of energy needed, okay, for a child to engage. So actually, the child's physical body is very important. And we have to not just focus on the language that the child is learning or being engaged with, but we have to look at the physique of the child. And we have to support the child in learning to sit up, in learning to have a straight back by being held, so that they can turn their head, so that they can observe and see. So it's a really detailed reinforcement, really, of muscular development and locating sense within the environment. Then we talk about the mand, okay? And actually, the mand is not something that needs to be vocal. It indicates an intent. So it might be something like the child walking over to a cupboard and putting the hand up. Okay, so the cupboard might have the cookie jar in it, and the child is indicating through that non-verbal way. So this is the behavior that I was talking about earlier on, about watching what's happening, watching how the child is communicating with us. While the child may not need to vocalize, the fact that they're reaching for the area where the biscuits are is actually telling us they need help. It's saying that they're pointing to or they're touching. And this is very important in a behavior language chain, okay? Because it helps us understand that the child is ready to start teaching a language. Oh, you're looking for a biscuit. You want biscuit. So we might even use love and use our language with it. So that bit of manding that the child is doing is telling us to be verbal, to induce the child into the business of communicating with us. The other part, the tact, then is the contact with the object. Okay. So where the child sees an object like a dog and says dog, and we say, yes, it's a big dog. So that's the tact. So you can see that the three here actually are really very important for the very, very young child who may be finding learning a language difficult. So that audience relationship is about the connectedness that we have and the negative responses that we might give that might be harmful might stop the child from being motivated to do something again. So we have to be really careful about our relationships with the child, not just take down the biscuit and hand it, but we have to do the communication piece. We have to make sure that that child's want is being served by our verbal responses. Now, echoic behaviors, okay, are not just ordinary repeated things that the child, for instance, the child might say, Thomas, 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 when they want Thomas the Tank Engine. But what we have to do is we have to say, Thomas, oh yes, you're asking for Thomas the Tank Engine, and encourage the child to do that. Now, there are two different types of echoic behaviors, and one is repeating something that someone else said, which is echoic, or echoing something else. And the other one is pallialeic, which is a self-constructed piece of a phrase, for instance, I want biscuit, I want biscuit, I want biscuit, where they keep continuously saying it. Echoic behaviors might be a really good place to start with thinking about what the child is processing here and how significant they are. So I'm going to go on to the next slide only because what I want you to do is to start thinking about all of those in relation to what's common but unique and what are the areas that challenge and how do we then look at expanding a child's learning. So as I mentioned just a minute ago, executive function, it's like the chief executive officer of the brain. It's the control area. You might think of it as a computer who is giving out instructions. But for us, the most important thing is to look at how the child is playing, how the child is moving within the environment, and what elements and aspects of the child tell us that they are initiating something for themselves. So we look at how the child is playing with toys. We look at the focus that the child has, how they are moving, manipulating, how they maintain the planning and organization of something during a play process. So if a child is sitting, and for instance, if the child is rocking forward and back, but has nothing in front of them, the thing to do is not to stop the rocking, but to introduce them to a little bit of something to draw attention to them. So to begin the process of making their executive function come to light. This is all about a child being part of and engaged in creating opportunities for their own learning. And it means that their memory of maybe moving something or manipulating something needs to be embedded. So we offer the same activity to the child, not because of its repetition or not because of that it's something that the child likes, but actually to develop the memory of the child in the short and in the long term, so that they begin to make creations between the muscle movement that they have and the brain activity that is happening at the time. So the child needs to be able to start to self-monitor their own activities so that you can say, well, look, you did that. You know, you've been engaged in this peg building. So maybe they're putting pegs into a pegboard, or maybe they're moving a piece of jigsaw, the knobbed cylinder, for instance, over and back. And they need to start doing the self-talk in the head. And this is where emotional regulation comes from. So when you see children that are dysregulated emotionally, what we need to activate is the executive function of that child. We need to go back to the CEO in the brain and start looking at how to initiate, how to get that piece going and to build then, because it's through the executive function that the child builds on meaning and understanding. So there's lots of things about language disability and ability. And I really would like you to have a little look at what you think is language ability or language disability, because actually it belongs within the two domains, okay? Two domains. There might be an issue with one domain or two domains. Caroline, what are you talking about in relation to the domains of language? This comes back to how children learn language in the first place. And it all comes from their environment. It all happens by learning those sounds of language. It all means how do they manipulate those sounds? In morphology, we talk about adding an S to the end of the word to make a plural. The semantic bit is about being able to identify that that is the cup. That's my cup. I always use it and it is mine. Whereas if I was to introduce something like a red cup, the child might get completely distracted by the notion of red itself. So keeping things simple from the beginning is really important. And starting with simple sentence constructs and structure is an essential. And then when we look at pragmatics, we're actually looking at the rules and the social relationships that the child has. So learning the code here is what this is about, and understanding the family's relation with language and how the family use language will really make a difference to us. So in our early years, in our Ashter curriculum, actually it's all based on the semantic, the semiotic theory. Okay, so that semantic bit. I'm giving you a message, you understand it, you're relating to it. Doesn't matter if you say the word back, you might make a sound back, but actually you've created a mental concept. It's very complicated, okay? But it is a really important thing to understand that that a sign in a community makes a difference. And I'll give you an example of this. A child with an intellectual disability was moving around the room and starts banging on the window. And how you interpret that is really important, because this child is giving you a sign that has a meaning for them, but for you, window means open the window, Window means you want to go outside. Window means you want the curtain or the blind closed. What does it mean? So actually, while that child communicates to us is incredibly relevant because it's in this breakdown of communication that the child becomes frustrated. The child gets angry. And so in this instance, I didn't understand that the child wanted out. They wanted to go outside. They were looking for the out. They were looking for the out sign. So they were banging on the window. I was opening it. I was pulling down the blind. I was opening the blind. I was doing all sorts of things, but I wasn't getting it through. And it was what was wrong was I didn't understand the semiotic sign. I didn't understand the sign that the child was using for out. So we need to be very observant and we need others to help us on this journey. So you know that there are receptive language and expressive language. And this is where the challenges lie. And I've put a few of them here on this slide so that you can have a little look at them yourselves later on. But actually, the beginning piece starts with the listening to and understanding. So leaving time to think about what they've heard and really giving time to listen to other sounds in their environment. I hear a car. I hear a dog barking. So being able to do those and allow them to pinpoint what it is really important. So drawing greater attention to sounds in the environment and giving opportunities to listen to our environment. Then when it comes to expressive language, this is a really complicated place. Okay. And the technical elements, like for me at the moment, I have an issue with my vocal cords. And so we have to make sure that everything is working properly for children to be able to speak properly and to be able to get the sounds out. So we're not qualified in that field or that space. But what we can do is we can look for and support the children in a number of different ways. Okay. So being careful with how we express, okay, and building the child's vocabulary from a very young age is very important. Now, I've put this on a slide for you so that you can have a little look on it because it's particularly focused on developmental language disorder, but it's also very relevant to a lot of other, maybe I'll say conditions or challenges that children experience. But look what's in the middle, phonology. So the sounds are actually what really matter. So learning sounds, and I'm not talking about alphabet sounds. I'm actually talking about sounds that they hear, the keys rattling, that they've been drawn to those attentions. It's after those that we've engaged them in really good listening that then we can build sounds relating to vocabulary and maybe the alphabet. But it's very important that we look at how they might not understand it. So learning a sound and learning the meaning, learning a sound and learning the name, okay, is really important. Building the verbal learning memory so that children can actually start then to use it when they feel confident that they can use it. So what I'm actually talking about is a total language approach using signs and symbols alongside the sensory elements of learning. So making sure that the child can see, making sure that the child feels vibrations on their lips, making sure that they, even if you put a balloon, a balloon against a child's lips, they feel that sensation. And we play lots of games. We blow raspberries at children. We go ba 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 ba. We do all of those vocaling sounds so that they can hear. But we need to use the other senses as well. Okay, we need to engage them in other senses. I smell. Okay, and then tell them what you smell. I smell bananas. Someone's having bananas for lunch. someone's having an orange for break. The same with putting it in on the mouth so that they can feel the sensation, know what the smell of a banana is, the taste of a banana is, and that's the word for banana. So really engaging those sensory areas from a very young age are really critical and key. So I mentioned the importance of play. Well, we are probably the most experienced teachers when it comes to play. And when we talk about play in its full sense. So we talk about free play, we talk about child-led play, we talk about teacher-led play, where you might be leading the play, and then learning is directed. It's directed. So we make sure that we are using the full play experiences for children to learn language. And there is nothing more important than doing this all through play and activities. So you can see here that the predictors of issues in literacy all stem from understanding vocabulary, whether it's a verbally spoken or non-verbally indicated. We need to know that. Phonemic awareness, knowing this that letter makes a sound. That word starts with the sound. Okay, alphabet awareness. And a lot of us actually neglect this. We forget to teach children the alphabet. We're so busy focused on sounds, but we need to do it because without that, we can't move on to concepts about print. And early writing starts from the moment that the children pick up a pen or a crayon or a pencil or a paintbrush, anything at all, and they will hold it the way they want to hold it until they have their muscle skills development, their fine muscle skills developed. And they can invent words, they can invent spelling. And we encourage that because it's important. I have a really quick story to tell you about a clever relationship that a mum had with a very small 2-year-old while on the bus. And I'm calling it On the Bus with Evie. So Evie is a very, very young toddler and she's sitting on mum's knee. And mum has a journey ahead of her to go from town out to where she's stopping. And to keep Evie interested in things around her, mum starts to point out things like, oh, there's a hat, there's a pair of gloves, there's a handbag, there's a man, red coat. And so mum is really busy labeling things around. When Evie gets a little bit fed up with that game, she moves on and she takes out from her bag a book and she starts pointing. And lo and behold, I see Evie pick up her finger and start to point to certain things and look up to mum, pointing and looking up. What a wonderful relationship of language that is happening. And Evie hasn't spoken anything. She's made a few sounds, but she's not actually speaking anything. Then what I see mum do, which I thought was really interesting, was she took out for Evie a, a cloth book. And Evie became the reader of the cloth book. So when you see something like that happening, you realize how rich and how important the experience for the child is in that interaction, in that child relationship. And there are lots and lots of research in relation to the importance of that, and that we need to be doing more of that in early childhood. So what I'm asking and what I'm saying here is that we need to negotiate the learning space with children. We need to kind of give them the natural environment in which they can find the energy to be able to communicate with others. And that is really important in rhymes and poems and songs. So, yes, children with Down syndrome, with additional needs, children who are finding language development different, actually need what we would do naturally with children. They need more rhymes, they need more poems, they need more songs, and they need you to be going with the flow. So if we stop and think about this, actually, what we see here is the development of literate behaviours between peers. So this bit of engaging with the children, we don't know when we look at this picture, do any of these children have a learning disability? In fact, if you look at children in general and watch them play together, it's hard to know what's going on or who has a learning disability. So that's what's really important here, is actually allowing children to play with children. And the most important thing for us is using images to bring children on in learning. And so one of the images that I used in my own setting, and in particular for a child with autism, was an image of dancing, me dancing. And this child it was very difficult to engage him initially, but as soon as he began to realize that there was fun to be had when we were dancing in the room, when we were listening to music, listening and feeling music go through our system, he began to realize that he wanted to do this. But what he would do is to touch me on the cheek to make me sing, pat me on the face to make me sing a song. And then he'd put his feet on my feet and put his arms around me so that he could feel me moving through the room. And it was through all that interaction and that high levels of engagement that he began to ask for things again and again. And it's through that that he began to request music, that he began to request dance. So those environments are critically important to enable children to be literate, to find their literate selves. And remember what Whitebread said in 2010. He said that rhyme and wordplay enhances language acquisition and development. And he's absolutely right. The more time we spend for children with additional needs in drama, in play, in acting things out, in the role play activities that we might do, means that they have a better motivation to be engaged. So I'm going to bring you to this, just leave you with this quick little thing that really will activate for you, I suppose, and I hope, a sense of rhythm and pattern that brings language to life. And this is a Quentin Blake poem, Nice Weather for Ducks. We're all off to the river, along a muddy track, and we're joining in the duck song, quack, quack, quack. We each have our umbrella and our wellies and our mac, and we're joining in the duck song, quack, quack, quack. So what I'd really like you to do now is to think about how you would use sensory activity to engage children in really feeling a mucky track, in joining in the duck song. I mean, what a wonderful way to bring children to nature, bring them outdoors, let them experience learning across different environments, and not being afraid to manage a child who might have a learning disability. Treat them like you would ordinary children. Bring them out, let them play, look for the very, very, very early signs of connecting and relationship building. I've written a little piece which you can access really. I mean, it's a very, very small, short piece, and it's in Brainstorm, and that the connection is on the slides. But thank you very much, everybody, and I hope that you'll have some conversations for me. I hope I haven't gone over my time.
Caroline, thank you so much for such an interesting hands-on presentation on how to support language and literacy for children with additional needs in the early years. You give a fantastic demonstration on how to connect the theory to practice in a very simple way. And there are some fantastic practical tips here that can be used on a daily basis in the early years. Some lovely stories and some lovely experiences included. Thank you very much. So I'm now going to hand you over to our second speaker, Deirdre Field O'Sullivan. And Deirdre is going to talk about neurodiversity affirming practice and how it can support language development.
Thank you so much, Maeve. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Great.
yeah,
Thank you
great.
so much. Thank you, Dr. Carolan. That was a really enjoyable, really stimulating and detailed account for language development, and actually I had done music for my thesis for level 8, and the power of music for all children with or without disabilities was quite phenomenal in my research. And also your story element, your lovely quack quack quack, really brought me back to the Vivian Custom Paley book, and how important storytelling is from a pedagogical point of view. So you really got me thinking again. I'm going to have to sit down and start typing again. It's all your fault, Dr. Caroline, I think. So before I start up, I'm going to be talking about the neurodiversity affirming practice, and I'm going to be looking at it from a language development point of view. So I really want, I suppose, our students and educators who are here this evening to really think about reframing and looking through the lens differently to children from a language development point of view. And I suppose before I start, it's really, Dr. Caroline started kind of joined on this as well, but neurodiversity as a concept that maybe people could drop into the chat line now, if you would, what they would define as neurodiversity, or what they term it as, or they see it as in their professional practice. Just to give me an idea of, you know, the knowledge base that we have out there, because I know we're very competent and capable educators. And so that would be a really good starting point, if that would be okay, Liam.
That's perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Deirdre.
So if anybody wants to pop it in, I won't be mentioning any names, don't worry. If you could tell me a little bit about neurodiversity and what you perceive it to be, or what you see it to be and define it as, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much for your contributions. So I'm taking from the lack of feedback there that a child with additional needs, thank you so much. A child who learns differently, thank you. Range of differences in a child, thank you so much. And how our brain works. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your contributions there. So the differences in our brain. So let's see what I suppose our research papers tell us about that. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Bear with me a moment. Now, sorry for the delay. Okay, can you see that okay, Maeve?
Yes, perfect, Deirdre. Yeah, all good. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so neurodiversity affirming practice and how we support language development with it. And as I said, I really want you to try and look through a different lens this evening and reframe how you look at language development. Because when we do that with a neurodiversity approach, it can be hugely rewarding for us as educators and for the children and parents as well. So what's the meaning of neurodiversity? We all gave some wonderful responses there earlier in the differences in the brain. And of course, yes, as Dr. Caroline said, it was Judy Singer who first coined the phrase in 1998. But a lot of the references here to explain what neurodiversity means are quite different. The first one from Walker and Rainmaker talks about the dominant cultural qualities of neurocognitive activity, which kind of implies to us, I suppose, that the culture and the country and the community and society that you are embedded in may define what social etiquette or the typical neurocognitive activity should be or could be. It also tells us, Walker and Rainmaker again, that the brain, the neurodiversity is not just referring to neuro as the brain, but actually it's referring to the nerves. So that encapsulates both body and brain. And again, that goes back to Dr. Caroline's feedback on how physical movement is just as important when it comes to language development, and the two are intertwined together. Roar and Frew describe neurodiversity as how people experience the world differently thinking, learning, and interacting. And that very much goes back to the social model, focusing on society and how we interact with society and possibly the barriers that might be encountered there. And Sulan Park really focused on that strengths-based approach, which is so important and something I have found to work extremely well in early years settings. So if we're really going to talk about neurodiversity as an approach, we probably need to look beyond that and look to our past, see where we came from, where we started, and how we got to where we are today. And maybe that will give us more of a framework of what we need to do to move on into the future for our children. So I suppose the main three disability models that we would have had presently and historically, starting with the religious model. Of course, we're very familiar with this because once we got our first government here in Ireland, the education system was very much under the Catholic Church. So therefore, that focus was always on institutionalisation, and we never really saw children with disabilities, saw children with language development delays, saw children with Down syndrome or autism, because there was that institutionalisation at the time. And so they were not evident in society and they were out of visual. And that lasted quite a long time. And if you probably want to compare to another type of model and progress in another European country, you could see that Italy, for example, would have taken on Malaguzzi, would have seen what happened in World War II and said that's not going to happen again. We're going to have the Reggio Emilia schools, and we are going to advocate that children think for themselves, that they are independent in thought. And by 1977, they had a fully inclusive education for all. And yet we were there in 1973 just getting our marriage bar lifted. So we were very much behind, and a little bit still today in that respect. There was a huge gap between us and other countries, and the progress in our perspectives on disability, in our perspectives on children with visible or non-visible disabilities. The medical model came into the forefront then because it was very much about focusing on medical intervention, and it was a deficit-based approach. It focused on the deficit and how they could normalise the child at the time was the term. They wanted to normalise the child so that they could put the child back in society. Very often they would do tasks like going to the shop, buying something, coming back, those typical activities that we do in our day-to-day work to normalise the child. And the medical professionals then became very much the gatekeepers for it. But then we saw the social model come in, and that really changed the dimension because the UNCRC, the UNCRPD, which came out in 2006, really focused on the social model and looked at society and what the barriers were in society and how we could remove them. And we were no longer looking at the physicality of the person. We were looking at the social policy and society in general. And that's really evident in Ireland today when we see that the government has a huge campaign presently for disability awareness. And it's been going on since August on billboards, in social media, on TV, on radio. And so they're working really hard to make disability awareness more of a focal point for our society and to understand the importance of that inclusion in our society as well. So we have progressed slowly into the social model, a little lagging behind because we didn't actually ratify the UNCRPD until 2018. But how are we going to get ourselves into the neurodiversity approach? And what would it mean if we did? Well, for language development, it would have huge advantages. The neurodiversity movement was really focused on the autistic rights movement, particularly in America in the 1970s. But it looked at social justice, a social ecological movement, and it was very much focused on almost that the differences in the brain were integral to the person. In other words, it was their personality. And to define their personality or to disregard it was to disregard their disability, whether it was visible or non-visible. So I'm going to start with the elements of neurodiversity affirming practice, if I may. And I really love this part of the presentation because we're talking about Armstrong 2012, and he wrote this gorgeous book, neurodiversity affirming practice, but he called it, well, I translated it into neurodiversity affirming practice, but he called it niche positive construction. And what he really meant was a spider spins a web because that's the perfect environment for them. A bird builds a nest because that's the perfect environment for them. So when we have children in our setting who are neurodivergent, they need an environment that's right for them. And in order to give that to them, we need to look at these components of the positive niche construction and see what kind of web and what kind of nest we need to put in place for these children. So there's lots of elements here like environmental modifications, positive role models, the strengths-based learning strategies, and all of these work extremely well for children who have language delays, language impediments, and language development challenges. How do we implement it? From a basic point of view, let's just look at the practicalities of putting this in place. The first thing and the most important thing, the first thing and the most important thing we need to do is, coming, so it's Christmas. Okay, so Armstrong, and I was talking about the spider spins the web and the bird builds the nest, and it's such a gorgeous analogy. So to find that perfect web or that perfect nest for your student or your children in your care in an earlier setting, you need to implement some key areas to make sure that the environment is as least restrictive as possible for them. These are really kind of practical things that you can put in place. The first thing is that we really have to look at our bias and our beliefs. Because we come from disability models in the past that have been quite outdated, we really need to sort of play catch up with the rest of Europe. And our biases and our beliefs need to be checked at the door to make sure that we are really connecting correctly with the terminology. So firstly, our language actually needs to change. Our language needs to be role modeling, it needs to avoid deficit-based language, and it needs to be all about inclusion. The second thing we need to do is really look at reflective practice and building self-awareness about the importance of the terminology we use, because that's so important for parents as well. They need to hear that positive affirmation if their child is doing well. I'd always say to a parent, they're on a journey at the moment. Now their bus hasn't got to the bus stop yet, but if you get there when it's ready, and I'd always use that analogy with parents, whether it was language development or any progress that they were looking for. Their bus is going at a certain speed and it'll arrive when it's ready. They're on that learning journey. The other area that's really important is focusing on that capabilities approach. What are the strong strengths that this child is showing us? Can we build language around that strength and that interest? You often have children with a passion for football or soccer, and getting all the names of all the soccer players on their favourite team and calling them out and talking about that language that they love so much can actually just bring out this great light in them, an interest in language. Patience, space, time, and a slow relational pedagogy, which is what our new ASHTR, which is under consultation in the final consultation phases, is telling us about so much. That slow relational pedagogy is imperative in order to handle opportunities for language. Sensory stress factors, we have to remember that they can also have a huge effect on language. And the best part of having, I suppose, that inclusive ethos in your pedagogy and in your setting is you have neurodiverse children and neurotypical children, and they're working together to support each other, building tolerance and empathy in your neurotypical children and building social understanding in your neurodiverse children. So there's benefits for both in it. So how can we help? Well, first, we must focus on that trauma-informed practice, which has been huge since post-COVID. There are a huge amount of children that have come into early years in the last few years, and they have trauma in their past. This can hugely influence their behaviour and their language development. And again, we must look at ACE, adverse childhood experiences. The causes or the sources of those language delays could be in that. Once we've ascertained that and built a really strong relationship and partnership with parents using positive language and talking about their learning journey and how it's progressing, we can then look outside our practice to aim support. The public health service, a huge resource, assessment of need, although long waiting list, it's still important to go through that process. Because even though the medical model might be something that we are unsure of using or may not be accessible to us, parents really want to check everything for their child. They really almost need to know what areas are most concerned so that when they progress, their educational supports reflect that, which is so important.
Sorry, Deirdre, will you move on the slides? The slides again, Deirdre. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So I suppose the final thing I just wanted to say before I hand you back to me is that there are lots of practical things that we can do. The first thing I would say is love is hugely influential and effective in the early years. And I've used it over the last years with lots of children who were nonverbal or had nonverbal communication and were not yet towards the verbal communication stage of their journey. I've also love using visuals and actually getting the lanyard and putting lots of visuals where it's a picture of mom when it's home time, whether it's a picture of dad when it's home time, whether it's a picture of their favorite toys in early years, having that lanyard for the child and actually they wearing it, they taking control of the choice of communication that they use and then using that to express their preferences. There's such simple things that you can do that usually really help children to develop that understanding of language. And of course, us using the right language and terminologies, and then of course that lovely slow relational pedagogy will be hugely beneficial. So finally, I'll put it back to you, Maeve. And again, apologies to our participants this evening for the issues with my slides. I hope it hasn't deterred in the message, but there will be a recording and I'm sure the slides will be available if anybody requires them. And this is my reference list if anybody wants that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. Such an interesting, detailed presentation on the whole area of neurodiversity and how it can support language development in practice. Again, very good linkage of theory to practice in a very simple way, and some very good practical tips on how to apply to practice as well on a daily basis. So thank you very much, Deirdre. Well done.
Thanks, Maeve. Sorry for the inconvenience again.
Not at all. Absolutely no problem. So I think now we're going to hand over to some questions. Is that right, Margarita?
That's right, Maeve.
Okay.
If you check there in your chat, you'll see I've been sharing some with.
Okay. Right. So a question here from Katie Kelly. Carol and Deirdre, could you both elaborate, please, on specific tools or technology, that have shown success in supporting language development for children with additional needs?
Deirdre or myself, I don't know who wants to go first.
I don't mind. Deirdre? Yeah, okay, Deirdre.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I was indicating to Caroline. That's okay.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll start. I suppose it depends on the age of the child, which is really, really important. So sometimes we use what we call soft technologies. And those soft technologies are really very simple and very basic. And they're real objects, and they're just objects that the child comes along and touches. Okay, so later on, as the child starts to develop and attention begins to build, so it's really important. It's the bit I was telling you about, which is really quite important, because if the child can't focus or can't look at a switch system or a telephone device that might have an app on it, then they're not going to be engaged in that. So developing the eye contact, the relationship, first and foremost, is actually quite important, because it won't make sense to the child if we're not using it ourselves. So it's whatever we start to use to communicate. So, for instance, there's a boy that I work with, and he has a phone that is connected and hanging from his neck, a little bit like what Deirdre was talking about when she was saying to put all the signs on the lanyard. Okay, this child has his own phone, and he uses the Grace app. Now, he only uses it for his own purposes, such as he wants ice cream, you know, or he wants crisps or something. So he's really clever with how he does it. If I want him to do something and I try to use the phone to communicate with him, he gets very annoyed and very cross, because that's his system of communicating. So I think what Deirdre mentioned earlier on was really quite important. So building up the sign system. So that semiotic theory of language development is what we're talking about. Like what does the sign relate to? Okay. And so we do use, and when later on, when children are a little bit more mature, we can use the likes of switch systems where children can communicate through switch, or we might use the alphabet where they're spelling out beginning of words, and sometimes they get so good at that that they actually leave out the vowels, and we can interpret what the word means because of their constant reaction. But I mean, that would be where I would start. I would always start with the object first, and how that object relates to that child's life.
That's great. Thank you very much, Caroline. Another question here from Yvonne. Her question is it up to us as educators to enhance the learning environment to enable neurodiversity? I probably, on maybe Deirdre or whoever. Is it up to us as educators to enhance the learning environment to enable neurodiversity?
Absolutely. In fact, the pedagogy and the ethos that we put into a setting will only be reflected in the progress of the children that are in that setting. So if you're automatically going into a setting and you're thinking about the strengths of the children that are in that room, the abilities of the children in that room, and how you can build them into different areas, then you're straight away going in with a neurodiversity approach. But if you go into the room and you say, well, he needs any support now, and he needs any support now, and he's nonverbal, and there's this issue and there's that issue, then you're framing your brain in a negative manner as an educator. And actually that can be really overwhelming, and it can be really hard to work in that sort of frame of mind. So what I found was I would constantly reflect on my practice every day and say, okay, did I advocate for that child correctly? He has chosen to communicate nonverbally, and I must respect that. How can I enhance that for him? So the way that I'm verbalizing it now is by doing it in a positive way. So I'm speaking in a neurodiversity approach manner. Because what I'm saying to you is, I'm not saying, well, that child isn't talking yet, so what am I going to do to solve that problem? No, I'm reframing my brain and I'm saying, what can I do to enhance the experiences of this non-verbal communicator and allow them to communicate more effectively non-verbally, until such time as their bus, as I call it, arrives at the stop where they are verbal in their communication choice. And that is the first step, I think. And when you start to reframe your brain like that, I found personally, every time I went into that setting, I had a different perspective on the children I was engaging with. So the child who had challenges with language, and I brought out his favourite soccer team, and we had the whole pictures of them up on the wall, and he learned every single surname of every single player and spoke it. So language development comes from strengths. It never comes from deficits. So we have to focus on strengths. And if you do that, you're well on the way to to having a neurodiversity approach and a neurodiversity family practice. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. Thank you. Another question. Maybe I'm not sure who will answer this now. The question is, how do you support a child? Any advice on supporting a child with echolalia, repeating what the teacher says? Any advice here?
Yeah. Will I take that one, Deirdre? Yeah. Okay. So echoleic behaviours, like what I said earlier on, and this is really quite important. Echoleic behaviours are part of the processing system of a child, where the child is using the language to hear it being said again and again and again. And that's really important because and it's well researched actually, that when a child is repeating something, that what they're trying to do is locate its meaning. So for instance, let's say for instance a child is saying, open your bag, open your bag, open your bag. The instruction that the child has been given at the time is complete in that phrase or that sentence, but actually there's a lot in that the child is trying to work through. So first and foremost, maybe it's about bag, and so that the child gets the bag first. Bag, open. Okay, so it might be something as simple as going back and looking at your own use of language within the classroom and for that child, because that child is probably trying to work out, what do I do first? Do I go get the bag first and open it, or do I open something that I haven't got in my hand? And where is it? And what do I do? So it's all about how we communicate with the child. And so that will become less evident when we start looking ourselves at how we're using language. Now, in some cases, and Deirdre will maybe talk about this too, you have children who come in and they start on a pattern of repeating, for instance, a story or a rhyme or something. And if you interrupt them, they have to start again at the beginning. And that's because they're in a process of working their way through to get to the end. And then they might start back at the beginning again, but it's only because their working memory, their language knowledge is beginning to be formulated. So we don't stop or interrupt someone in the process of doing it. But what we might do is we might direct the child non-verbally to the bag to get the bag, and then they'll understand to open the bag. Does that answer the question? And maybe Deirdre, you might want to add to it.
Okay.
No, you're fine, Caroline. That's perfect. Actually, I just saw a question there from Emma Morgan, and I'm being very forward with it. But could I answer that question?
Yes, this is the question. Sorry, yeah, from Emma. This is the question. I have special educational needs. So how would I be able to help and support a child with the same needs as myself?
I think that's such a wonderful question. Do you mind if I take that, Dr. Caroline, there for a moment? As you know, in my research for my dissertation, I had actually many participants who were neurodivergent themselves. And actually what they found and what we reminded them to celebrate was their neurodiversity. And we reminded them that they see the world differently. So they may be able to connect with that child really well. They might be able to see what they are trying to communicate non-verbally or physically or emotionally. And we mightn't see it from a neurotypical point of view. But because your brain is different and neurodivergent, you can also have that as a huge strength. And I have so many students of my own who are neurodivergent, and I always remind them to celebrate that, because that is a unique quality that will allow them to connect with children that other educators may never be able to connect with. So please, Emma, celebrate that neurodiversity and also realise that it can be a huge strength. And we've seen from the first 5 implementation changes this week that the AIM model is going to extend, fingers crossed, outside the 3 hours of the ECCE. And if it does, then neurodivergent educators will have an opportunity to shine in that particular area because it may be an area of strength for them. So no longer will they have 3 hours of being paid by the government, they may have a lot more. So please do celebrate it, Emma, and acknowledge it as part of your personality and who you are, and use it in your work to your strength. I would recommend highly.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. That's fantastic. Thank you. Well, we have one more. We'll have one more last question. I know there are a number of other questions still unanswered, but they can be answered and emailed then to the students. Okay, at the end of this session. So another question: are there any ongoing research initiatives or emergent trends in the field of neurodiverse language development that educators should be aware of? So any ongoing research initiatives, please. I'm not sure, Deirdre or Caroline.
Yeah, it's a huge field actually. I think, Deirdre, you'd agree. It's an absolutely evolving field, and my own research was on the literacy practices of children with autism in mainstream primary, in early years mainstream primary classrooms. And I suppose at the time, when I started off down that road, it was because I myself was so frustrated at this notion of teaching language or teaching literacy. And I remember thinking to myself, am I like, when we have these moments in our services or in our settings, and we think that's the child isn't getting it, or the child is not making sufficient progress, that we actually have to stop and ask ourselves, actually, it's me and what I'm saying, it's me and what I'm doing. And it's all about that. And from the beginning of that search, my own search myself, and I think, Deirdre, you'd probably be the same, that in exploring and in going deeper, you begin to realize the research that's out there. And one of the researchers that I really enjoyed reading was Barry Prizon's work, where he particularly focused in on the likes of echoic behaviours, or behaviours that were a means in which that maybe we were missing as a communication of intent. So I think that's a really important thing, is that, yeah, there are so many really wonderful research opportunities out there, and constant research that's going on. Now, a lot of it might be very context driven, like in the States, for instance. The research in the States is quite program development, making things normal for children, as opposed to respecting where children come from. And I think that's what's really important here, is that you don't apply a program to all children. You have to look at the child's needs, as what Deirdre was saying earlier on. They're so unique. They are so sensitive to their own likes and dislikes, and that we have to get to know them. And it is about that slow relational pedagogy. It comes all the way back to, do what the child is asking you to do, be led by the child and engaged by the child. Would that make sense to you, Deirdre?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a master's student, I've only, obviously the tip of the iceberg is all I have explored to this extent. But I just think there's huge opportunities going forward for neurodiversity, and that reframing of our brains to see the strengths in the children around us. And I just think when you do that, it makes your work as an educator so rewarding, so positively affirming. And I think, constantly reflecting and changing, and being neurodiverse yourself, actually, changing your perspective on what you're seeing every day, and understanding the strength of being neurodiverse, and using it in your own reflective practice as well, can be a huge asset. But the research is only the tip of the iceberg, absolutely. There's so much more to go. Yeah, it's going to be great.
Okay. Thank you so much to both Caroline and Deirdre. Two fantastic presentations, very informative Very interesting, fantastic, practical, everyday tips on how we can apply theory to practice. Thank you so much for your time and for a very interesting evening.
I might just say one other thing. If anybody's in, and I'm sure you've come across it, Olga Bogdashina has a really excellent approach to communication with for children with additional needs, in particular autism. So I can send some references as well if people are interested in that. But Olga Bogdashina is really, really, really passionate about how behaviours are part of the communication system.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you very much, Caroline. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So, any remaining questions, they will be emailed to the students, and this has been recorded. Um, you will all, so it'll be available in the next day or two, and you'll all receive then a CPD certificate as well for attendance as well this evening. So, thank you very much to you both and to everybody for attending. A great participation. Thank you to you all for participating and all your feedback and questions. A very interesting evening overall. Thank you.